Sheila never intended to learn the truth the way she did. It came to her not as a confession or confrontation, but as an accident of proximity. A fragment of conversation drifting through a half-closed door at precisely the wrong moment. What she heard did not arrive gently. It struck with the force of betrayal, each word confirming what she had long suspected but refused to name. Deacon and Taylor, bound together not by circumstance but by secrecy, had crossed a line that Sheila believed belonged to her alone. The realization did not simply wound her pride, it ignited something far more volatile. For Sheila, love had always been inseparable from possession, and possession from entitlement. To discover that Deacon's loyalty had shifted, that Taylor had become the quiet center of his affection, felt like a theft of identity itself. The humiliation burned deeper because it was private, because it unfolded without witnesses, leaving Sheila alone with her fury and the certainty that she had been replaced. That certainty metastasized quickly. It fed on memory, on every glance she had misinterpreted, every absence she had rationalized, every moment she had believed herself still central to Deacon's life. Now those moments rearranged themselves into a narrative of exclusion, one in which Taylor was not merely a rival but a usurper. Sheila's anger was not loud at first. It was surgical, sharpened by the calm clarity of someone who believes she has been wronged beyond forgiveness. In her mind, this was not a matter of jealousy but justice. She framed herself as the injured party, the one pushed aside after everything she had endured. That self-justification became the fuel for what followed, allowing resentment to masquerade as righteousness. While Sheila spiraled inward, Steffy's unease grew louder by the day. She had long understood the danger Sheila represented, not as an abstract threat but as a living, breathing volatility capable of erupting without warning. Steffy warned Taylor repeatedly, her concern rooted not in disapproval of Deacon but in an instinct honed by experience. Sheila did not lose gracefully. She did not retreat. She escalated. To Steffy, the growing intimacy between Taylor and Deacon was not romantic, it was reckless. Yet Taylor, exhausted by years of restraint and drawn to the comfort Deacon offered, found herself dismissing the warnings. What began as cautious affection deepened into emotional dependence, blinding her to the shadows gathering at the edges of her happiness. Love, for Taylor, felt like a long-delayed reward, and she was unwilling to relinquish it out of fear. Sheila's breaking point arrived with terrifying inevitability. The knowledge she carried could no longer be contained, no longer diluted by distance or denial. She moved with purpose toward Taylor's office, her steps steady, her mind frighteningly clear. The object she carried was mundane, almost absurd in its ordinariness. A pair of paper scissors, the kind meant for harmless tasks. In Sheila's hand, however, it became a symbol of intent, a physical manifestation of rage that demanded release. When she entered the office, there was no hesitation, no attempt at subtlety. This was not a conversation she intended to survive unchanged. Her presence filled the room with threat, her words laced with promises of irreversible consequence. For Sheila, Taylor had crossed a boundary that demanded punishment, and in that moment, Sheila believed she was the one empowered to deliver it. Taylor's shock was immediate and paralyzing. The office that had always represented control and professionalism transformed into a trap. The walls suddenly too close, the air too thin. Sheila's fury was not performative, it was intimate, personal, and terrifyingly sincere. Taylor understood then, too late, the cost of underestimating Sheila's capacity for violence. Fear rooted her in place, not because she lacked strength, but because the situation defied logic. This was not an argument that could be reasoned away. It was a reckoning driven by obsession, one that recognized no rules beyond its own emotional logic. Steffy arrived not a moment too soon. Her entrance shattered the closed circuit of terror, replacing it with chaos. She did not pause to assess or strategize. Instinct propelled her forward, every warning she had ever voiced converging into a single, desperate act of protection. She saw the scissors, saw Sheila's intent, and reacted with the ferocity of someone who understands that hesitation is fatal. Her only goal was to disarm, to neutralize the threat before thought could catch up to fear. What followed was not a fight in any controlled sense, but a collision of bodies, intentions, and panic. The room erupted into motion, balance lost and regained in frantic bursts. In the confusion, time fractured. The struggle blurred cause and effect, turning intention into accident and accident into catastrophe. The scissors, never meant to be a weapon yet wielded as one, slipped from Sheila's grip at the precise moment Steffy lunged. The impact was swift and horrifyingly final. There was no dramatic pause, no opportunity for reversal. Sheila collapsed, the fury that had driven her extinguished in an instant. The silence that followed was deafening, a void where sound itself seemed unwilling to exist. Death arrived not as punishment or resolution, but as an irreversible consequence no one had intended yet no one could undo. Steffy froze, her body still braced for a threat that no longer existed. The realization crept in slowly, then all at once, overwhelming in its clarity. She had not meant to harm, only to protect, yet the outcome was undeniable. Horror flooded her, eclipsing fear, eclipsing even grief. She stared at Sheila's lifeless form, unable to reconcile the woman who had terrified her family for years with the stillness now occupying the floor. The knowledge that she had played a role in ending a life shattered something fundamental inside her. Protection had transformed into guilt, instinct into tragedy. Taylor's reaction was no less devastating. Shock rendered her immobile, her mind struggling to process the abrupt transition from imminent death to survival brought at an unbearable cost. She felt complicit simply by being there, by loving the wrong person, by ignoring warnings she now wished she had heeded. The weight of Sheila's death pressed down on her with suffocating force, mingling with gratitude and terror in a combination too complex to articulate. Survival did not feel like victory. It felt like a debt that could never be repaid. Finn arrived to a scene that redefined his life in a single glance. He saw Steffy standing beside Sheila's body, the truth instantly legible without explanation. The shock did not manifest as screams or collapse but as a hollowing out. A silence so profound it bordered on physical pain. Sheila was many things to him, dangerous, destructive, deeply flawed, but she was also his mother. The reality that she was gone, that her death had occurred at the intersection of his wife's fear and his mother's obsession, fractured his sense of order beyond repair. He stood suspended between love and loss, loyalty and disbelief, unable to anchor himself to either. The tragedy refused to resolve neatly. There was no clear villain, no single act of malice that could absorb the blame. Sheila's actions had set the stage, yet the final outcome belonged to chance, to panic, to a moment where intention and result diverged catastrophically. Steffy's horror deepened as she understood the permanence of what had happened. No explanation would erase the image, no justification would restore what had been lost. She feared not only the legal consequences, but the emotional devastation she had inflicted on the man she loved. Finn's pain was total and disorienting. He was forced to reconcile two irreconcilable truths: that Sheila had been dangerous, and that her death was unbearable. Grief did not come with clarity but with confusion, anger, and an aching sense of betrayal by fate itself. The woman who had given him life had taken so many others to the brink. And yet her end left him hollow rather than relieved. He looked at Steffy and saw both his wife and the person standing nearest to his mother's final moment. Love and resentment collided inside him, neither strong enough to fully eclipse the other. As the reality settled in, fear enveloped both Steffy and Taylor. They understood that survival did not mean safety, that the aftermath would demand answers no one was ready to give. The room that had witnessed the violence now held the weight of consequences that would ripple outward, touching every relationship, every certainty. Sheila's death was not an ending but a rupture, one that exposed the fragile architecture holding their lives together. In the end, the tragedy lay not only in the loss of life, but in the way love had been weaponized. Fear had been dismissed, and warnings had gone unheeded until it was too late. Sheila's obsession, Taylor's denial, Steffy's instinct, and Finn's divided heart converged in a moment that could never be undone. What remained was silence, grief, and the unanswerable question of how protection became destruction. And in that silence, each of them understood that nothing would ever return to what it had been before the scissors slipped, before intention gave way to consequence, and before one life ended in a room filled with fear, love, and irreversible loss. Panic did not explode in Steffy and Taylor all at once after Sheila's sudden death. It seeped in slowly, like poison entering the bloodstream, spreading through shock, disbelief, and the unbearable awareness that nothing about what had just happened could be undone. The stillness of Sheila's body was not relief, it was a threat. It represented not an end, but the beginning of consequences that could destroy everything they had fought to protect. In that suffocating silence, instinct overtook morality. Fear spoke louder than reason, and survival became indistinguishable from deception. Steffy and Taylor did not decide to lie because they were cruel or calculating. They decided because the truth felt like a weapon aimed directly at their family. One that would shatter lives indiscriminately if allowed to fire. The first moments after Sheila's death were fractured and disorienting. Steffy's hands trembled uncontrollably, her breath shallow, her body still braced for violence that had already ended. Taylor, trained for years to understand the human mind, recognized the look in her daughter's eyes immediately. Shock tipping into trauma, guilt already rooting itself deep inside. Neither woman spoke at first. Words felt dangerous, as if naming reality would make it permanent. Yet even in that paralysis, one certainty emerged with horrifying clarity. If the truth came out exactly as it was, Finn would lose not only his mother but his marriage, his sense of self, and possibly his future. The law would not care about intention. The world would not care about fear. And the cost would not be shared equally. It was Taylor who first articulated what both of them were already thinking. Though she did so reluctantly, her voice heavy with dread. Protecting Steffy had been her instinct since the day she was born. And that instinct surged now with desperate urgency. Steffy was not a killer, she was a woman who had reacted to imminent danger. But truth rarely survives intact once it passes through systems designed to assign blame rather than meaning. The decision to conceal what had happened was not framed as a crime in their minds but as a shield. A terrible, morally corrosive shield, but one they believed was necessary to keep their family from being destroyed. They moved Sheila's body with care that bordered on reverence. Not out of respect, but out of terror. Every sound felt amplified, every movement watched by unseen eyes. The world outside the walls of the villa seemed impossibly close, as though discovery waited just beyond the doors. They reconstructed the scene meticulously, transforming chaos into something that resembled inevitability rather than violence. Objects were repositioned, surfaces wiped clean. Time itself felt manipulated, stretched and folded until reality no longer aligned cleanly with memory. Each erased trace deepened the weight pressing down on them, because with every correction, they crossed further into a version of events that could no longer be reversed. Steffy participated mechanically, her body obeying commands her mind could barely process. She told herself she was doing this for her children, for Finn, for the fragile stability they had fought so hard to build. Yet beneath that justification, something darker stirred. She knew, even then, that erasing evidence would not erase guilt. The villa no longer felt like home, it felt like a mausoleum built around a lie. Taylor, watching her daughter dissociate in front of her, felt a surge of maternal responsibility collide with professional horror. She understood exactly what unresolved trauma could do to a person. And yet, she continued. Love outweighed ethics. Fear outweighed judgment. Finn sensed something was wrong almost immediately, though he could not have articulated why. It was not a single inconsistency, but a pattern of subtle deviations that set off his internal alarms. Years of medical training had conditioned him to recognize when symptoms did not align with diagnoses, when narratives skipped steps, when silence replaced expected grief. The atmosphere in the villa felt altered, heavy in a way that had nothing to do with mourning alone. Sheila's absence was undeniable, but so was the tension vibrating beneath every interaction. Finn noticed the way Steffy avoided certain rooms. The way Taylor's composure felt forced, brittle around the edges. These were not the behaviors of people processing loss honestly. As days passed, Finn's unease sharpened into suspicion. He replayed events in his mind, reconstructing timelines, searching for coherence. Sheila's death, tragic as it was, did not unfold in his memory with the clarity he expected. Details were vague, explanations too smooth. As a doctor, he had learned to distrust narratives that seemed overly controlled. Grief was chaotic, inconsistent, unpredictable. What he encountered instead was restraint, as though Steffy and Taylor were holding something back not out of respect, but out of fear. His questions became more pointed, not accusatory, but persistent. Each inquiry landed like a tremor, testing the structural integrity of the lie they had built. Steffy's conscience did not wait for exposure to begin its punishment. It arrived every night in the form of relentless nightmares. Sheila appeared in them not as a monster, but as a presence. Her eyes unblinking, her expression unreadable. Sometimes she spoke without sound. Sometimes she simply watched. Steffy woke drenched in sweat, her heart racing, her breath ragged, the image refusing to fade with daylight. Sleep offered no escape, only repetition. Guilt seeped into her waking hours, manifesting as irritability, distraction, and a constant sense of impending collapse. She jumped at sudden noises. She avoided mirrors. The villa itself felt hostile, every corner charged with memory. Taylor, too, began to fracture under the strain. Supporting Steffy had felt like the only choice at first, but as time passed, the weight of deception pressed down on her with increasing force. She knew better than anyone the psychological toll of suppressed trauma, the corrosive effect of living in contradiction to one's values. Each day she feared discovery more acutely, not only by law enforcement, but by Finn, whose quiet observations felt increasingly invasive. Taylor watched her daughter unravel and questioned whether protection had crossed into harm. Yet backing out now felt impossible. The truth, once delayed, gained momentum of its own, and the consequences of revelation only grew more severe with time. Finn's questions multiplied. He asked about timelines, about logistics, about details that seemed inconsequential on the surface but carried diagnostic weight. His tone remained calm, but his eyes betrayed a growing disquiet. Steffy felt those looks like knives. Every pause in conversation a threat, every silence an accusation. She attempted to maintain composure, reminding herself that panic would only confirm suspicion. But restraint required energy she no longer possessed. The strain of maintaining the lie began to erode her from the inside out. Her voice faltered. Her explanations grew inconsistent. The more she tried to appear normal, the more artificial she sounded. The tension reached a breaking point not through confrontation, but through exhaustion. Steffy could no longer endure the constant vigilance, the endless calculation of words and expressions. She loved Finn too deeply to continue poisoning their relationship with half-truths and omissions. The realization arrived not as a sudden decision, but as a collapse of resistance. Confession became inevitable, not because she sought absolution, but because she could no longer survive the lie. Carrying the truth alone had become more destructive than any consequence of sharing it. When Steffy finally told Finn what had truly happened, the moment felt suspended outside of time. The words, once released, could not be recalled, and as they spilled out, they reshaped everything between them. She did not frame herself as innocent, nor did she portray Sheila as purely monstrous. She described fear, chaos, instinct, and the irreversible outcome that followed. She admitted to the cover-up, to the deliberate construction of falsehoods designed to protect her family. The confession stripped her bare, leaving nothing behind but vulnerability and remorse. Finn's reaction was devastating in its quietness. Shock drained the color from his face, grief crashing into disbelief with overwhelming force. Learning that Sheila had died was one trauma. Learning how she had died was another entirely. Learning that the truth had been hidden from him fractured something fundamental. He felt betrayed not only as a husband but as a son. The woman who had given him life was gone, and the woman he loved most in the world stood at the center of that loss. Love and grief collided violently inside him, leaving him suspended between the urge to comfort and the need to recoil. The conversation that followed was not explosive, but heavy, saturated with emotion that resisted resolution. Finn struggled to reconcile Steffy's terror with the finality of Sheila's death. He understood instinct. He understood fear, but understanding did not erase pain. The knowledge that his mother's last moments had been marked by chaos and concealment haunted him deeply. He questioned not only the act itself, but the decision to exclude him from the truth, to deny him the right to grieve honestly. Steffy, watching Finn's devastation unfold, felt the full weight of her actions settle into permanence. She had confessed because she could not continue living in fear, but she now faced a different terror. That honesty might cost her everything anyway. Taylor, witnessing the emotional aftermath, realized that the lie they had constructed had not protected their family as intended. It had merely delayed the fracture, deepening it in the process. Nothing about the aftermath felt resolved. The truth had emerged, but its consequences were still unfolding. Finn was left to mourn a mother whose life and death were equally complicated, and to question a marriage built on love but scarred by deception. Steffy was left to confront the reality that protection, when guided solely by fear, can become its own form of violence. Taylor was left to reckon with the limits of maternal instinct when it collides with moral responsibility. What remained was silence, heavier now than before, filled not with secrets but with grief too vast to articulate. Sheila's death had not ended the danger, it had transformed it. The threat was no longer external, but internal, lodged within relationships strained by guilt, love, and irreversible truth. And as the villa stood unchanged around them, immaculate and deceptive, each of them understood that the real damage had already been done. Not in the moment of violence, but in the decision to hide it.